short disclaimer before jumping into the podcast. The views and opinions expressed by the interview guest in this podcast are solely their own and do not in any way represent the views, opinions or position of any organization with which the guest is or has been affiliated. All statements made by the guest reflect their personal standpoints only. Hi, welcome and grüezi to another episode of Governance Unplugged, Internal Audit, Risk and Controls. I'm Thomas Michel and today we are diving into one of the most elusive, sensitive and yet deeply impactful areas in the audit universe, auditing culture. Culture in the spotlight, where tone, behaviors and risks intersect. Culture drives behavior and behavior drives risks, but how do we as internal auditors assess something so intangible, so context dependent and often so politically charged? Today we're going to unpack what it really means to audit culture and why it matters, where the risks lie when culture is ignored and misjudged, and how internal audit can bring value without stepping into traps of subjectivity or overreach. I'm joined once again by Gavin Martin, whose deep experience leading audit teams through both hard controls and soft issues make him the perfect sparring partner for this topic. Gavin, welcome back and great to have you here.
Thomas, it's great to be talking with you again, and again, big hello to everyone that's listening.
So let's jump right into it and let's start with the why. Audit committees and regulators are talking more and more about tone at the top, speaking up culture and ethical leadership. But from your experience, Gavin, why is it so important that internal audit engages with the culture of an organization, and what's at stake if you don't do it?
It's a great question, Thomas, and I'm pretty sure that everyone listening can think of some sort of corporate embarrassment, and that's not just the for-profit sector, but also in the not-for-profit sector over the last 20 years, where behaviors and indeed culture have caused massive problems for those organizations, indeed causing many of them to fail or pay out a huge amount in some sort of compensation, recompense, or indeed lose their reputation if they're in the not-for-profit sector and people start to worry about whether they really had charitable aims. I mean, very quickly what comes to mind is like defeat devices in cars, which changed the amount of emissions that came out of those vehicles to get past, tests, or, some of the misuse of aid in the charity sector where it wasn't going to the intended recipients without strings attached for individuals to benefit, in certain countries. I'm reminded as well of the phrase culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's not entirely clear who first said this. It's attributed to a few different people when I look around the internet, but for me it's absolutely true. Poor culture can absolutely stop an organization from achieving its strategic objectives, and they could be for-profit strategic objectives or not-for-profit strategic objectives. And behaviors may well be the starting point. Individual behaviors in an organization that go unrewarded when they're good behaviors or unpunished, unchallenged when they're poor behaviors could be the starting point for that culture, the weaker culture to creep in. Or as you said, the tone from the top might be the driving force. A great tone from the top could really help an organization, but a poor tone from the top that is encouraging people to act in a certain way, allowing them to act unchallenged in a certain way, to maybe allow some of their values, which are common where they grew up, to come through, but is not what the organization desires to come through. And so what's at stake if we don't, was your question?
Yes, correct.
I mean, the loss of the organization, these things can touch right at the heart of the survival of an organization, parts of an organization. And for audit not to have a view on things like that, I think leads to, the loss of reputation of internal audit, what really is the purpose if audit is not able to spot some of these risks, is able to talk about them, get them out into the open and help the organization to deal with them.
So do I get this right, that culture isn't just a soft topic, but it's a core risk vector? And ignoring it could mean we are only seeing half of the picture. Do I get this right, Kevin?
Yes, I mean, I'd describe it just slightly differently, Thomas, which is I think, behaviors and looking at behaviors and understanding why they're happening is absolutely something that is a core risk vector. And that may or may not lead into there being some cultural problems, which again would be a cultural risk factor. But I'd really emphasize for the listeners not to think of culture in isolation without thinking about the underlying behaviors that may or may not turn into that culture or being created by a particular culture. The two go hand in hand for me always.
If you're shifting to the how, auditing culture can feel like walking a tightrope. Why is it so difficult to do it well? What are the key sensitivities that makes this such a complex area?
I think for me, Thomas, whenever I've talked about it, I mean, in previous jobs, I've designed approaches to auditing culture, starting not long after the financial crisis, actually, and coming up with ways to approach this. And I think if an auditor says to somebody, I'm going to audit your culture, people tend not to hear the your as being a very wide selection of your. It becomes a very personal thing. You as an individual, your culture, what might be wrong with it? And so I think there's a natural human reaction to almost hearing, I'm going to assess whether you've got the right values, whether you're a good person or a bad person. And so I think that intrinsically makes people very nervous, very worried. And because culture is a very broad subject, when someone says, I'm going to assess you against this broad subject and probably give you some binary answer of good or bad, I'm not surprised that the recipient of that message is nervous. What I find more helpful is if I'm talking to people about, we're of course going to audit what you do as a business, and we're going to understand how people are going about their jobs. And this is fundamental for me for the sustainability of a control framework. How people approach their tasks, what are they thinking about, what are they considering? How do they behave, how do they act, what things do they say are okay, what things do they say are not okay? Really vital aspects of looking at behavior, attitudes to risk, ways in which things are happening, and then you can assess, are these individual behaviors that are causing a problem? Or actually individual behaviors that generate exactly the right things happening in an organization? So is there something culturally going on that is driving the right things to happen that we could replicate? Or is there something culturally going on that is driving people to act in certain ways that is the wrong thing? And I think people are much more receptive to understanding why things are happening in a control framework in the way they're happening, and then saying, okay, so if I was monitoring that sort of thing in a different way, I might get different behaviors, might get more of the things I want to happen and less of the things I don't want to happen. And that for me is just a better way of having that conversation that feels much less personal about, Thomas, I'm going to come and assess your culture. It feels pretty stark, right?
Yeah, I mean, culture, it's such a critical point. It's local, it's layered, it's most often invisible unless you're really listening. So our tools as an internal auditor, they really need to be sharp, and our mindset needs to be respectful and curious all at the same time.
Absolutely. We've got to be careful that we might be treading on people's toes, as I often say here. They might not be entirely comfortable. And what you said about this local, layered culture, sometimes invisible. I mean, an organization could generally be doing entirely the right thing, and it goes into a new market and it doesn't understand some of the norms and the customs and how things operate, and suddenly find it is doing things that in its name that they would never be happy doing. And so it could be just a very localized situation that's going on where there's a different set of expectations and values that aren't understood, and people operate in that way because this is how everybody does it. And I've heard a lot in my auditing career, this is what everybody is doing. And often I've had to say to people, just because everybody does it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Maybe we want to be different from what everyone. And, the implied safety in numbers I've seen in many different organizations over the years being the wrong way to look at something.
If you talk a little bit about solutions, in your view, Gavin, how can internal audit truly add value when it comes to auditing culture? We all know that auditing culture isn't just about ticking boxes or writing standard reports. But what does it really look like when it's done right?
So I think, I'd simplify things, hopefully, as I talk this through. I hear organizations saying we're going to do an audit of culture. And then I hear organizations saying, culture behaviors are an integral part of every audit. And for me, largely, I would have most of the time looking at behaviors, understanding the behaviors should be part of every audit. Of course, we might be able to construct from time to time some very specific work, likely to be quite specialized work on particular topics of culture. But I'm mainly going to talk about what I think is the everyday bread and butter that people should be doing, which is in every piece of audit, have a think about what behaviors are you really expecting individuals in the control framework to be doing? How would you like them to be dealing with individual controls, individual business transactions? What do you expect when somebody monitors them doing it? And then seeing whether or not those behaviors, those actions, those attitudes are in place. And if not, brainstorm, why is it that that's happening and how does that seem to be different from what you'd expect to happen? I'll take it to a very simple example. I could be doing an audit of expenses and expense approvals. It's a relatively straightforward thing to do. There is a vast difference when I'm testing expenses. I come top down through the control framework and look at, are the expenses signed off? But the fact that someone has approved them means nothing about whether they should have been approved. And so I would want to understand what is it that people are looking at when they're approving them. If I look at them, would I approve them? Are people doing the right thing in checking, challenging, understanding? When they see something that isn't right, do they explain it away or do they go and try and explore to find out more? And so in every audit test, a good bit of auditing should be looking at what I would call the pervasive elements of a COSO control framework. And much of what we're talking about here, Thomas, sits in control environment within COSO. There's elements that feed into control activities and into monitoring. But essentially, what are people thinking about? What is allowed or not allowed? What should be approved or not approved? When something goes wrong, what happens? What are the rewards for doing things right? What are the disciplinary consequences for doing things badly? What are the performance management frameworks? What are the incentives? And so when I go auditing anything, I'm thinking about what would I expect somebody to do? What are those behaviors and what are they doing? If those behaviors aren't in line, is that an individual behavior problem? Or does it give me an objective indicator that there is something going wrong in lining up with the values of the organization, the laws and rules and regulations and all of those elements? And if there is that a localized cultural problem? Or is it a more systemic cultural problem? And all of those are interesting conversations to have with an organization when you're talking about issues that you're finding, problems that you're raising. And auditors need to be brave enough to say whether they think something is a localized behavioral problem, maybe a local cultural issue, or maybe something a bit more systemic.
I really appreciate that you brought the COSO framework into this conversation. I couldn't agree more. The control environment plays such a crucial role when we evaluate controls within an organization and across processes. And I always try to take into account the control environment of an organization when I perform an internal audit. And to be honest, I felt over the last few years, its importance kind of faded. So I'm generally glad to see you're bringing it back into the conversation. So if I understand you correctly, you are suggesting that auditing culture shouldn't be treated as a standalone activity, but rather as a lenses or like a perspective that should be embedded into what we already do as internal auditors.
I absolutely. I think the majority of the time, having some sort of look at culture, behaviors in everything that we do and having our eyes open for what might be going on, we're far more likely to identify where there could be a cultural problem. Or conversely, where actually the culture is really good. I would describe that where you see pressures on behaviors and culture, you should automatically think as an internal auditor, I don't think this control framework is going to be sustainable over time. Something is going to go wrong here. Where I see really good attitudes to risk, the right tone from the top, people doing the right thing, those things reinforced, things going wrong, not reinforced. It tells me quite a bit about. I think this control framework might sustain some stress points, might be able to survive in those circumstances, might be sustainable. Because for me, Thomas, what we should be worried about as internal audits is when any control framework is under stress. So if I suddenly say to a function, the amount of customer transactions have doubled and they're working really hard, or you need to do everything that you're doing today, but in half the time, or half the people leave, and so everyone is covering everyone else's job. I guarantee that in those moments with people under stress, that's when corners could get cut. That's when people take that shortcut. That's then maybe something doesn't get checked that should have been checked. And in those moments, new ways of working are designed, new ways of operating come to life, and actually that could be the place where it goes wrong for an organization and it isn't seen. People maybe really trying to do the right thing of surviving through a time of stress, but really not doing the right thing for the organization in line with how it would like to happen. So mainly audit by audit. As I said, of course, there is the possibility to look at some cultural topics in isolation. But I think that's going to form much less of the audit plan overall in terms of percentage of time and effort.
We often talk about the tone at the top, but culture speaks in whispering, in patterns, in behaviors, and very often also what's left unsaid. In your view, Gavin, what are the warning signs we should be watching for where culture could start to get off lines?
Yeah, I think, Thomas, some of them I mentioned that you could be asking lots of questions in any audit. And I've heard this described as the auditor's nose in the past, that whether it's an intuition, a sixth sense, whether it's just experience or logic, whatever comes into play as to this doesn't sound right, doesn't feel right, maybe people aren't doing the right things. There's lots of opportunities in being in meetings, being in conversations, observing what's going on and what's happening, to make a decision as to whether or not this is what I would expect to be happening if we were doing things in line with the values, doing the right thing, in line with laws and regulations. There are lots of opportunities, though, in other data points to give yourself some things to ask questions about. And what I would say is most of these data points do not give you an answer as to whether there is good behavior, good culture, or bad culture. I'll give a couple of examples. I could look at mandatory training and mandatory training completion. So most organizations will say everybody needs to do some sort of training to keep their skills up to date on a regular basis. It's quite useful to look at the completion rates of mandatory training, whether people are doing them on time, does everyone leave it to the last minute, what percentage of people did it. But I don't look at it and then go, because a function had 100% mandatory training completed, that must be good. What it allows me to do is ask questions about how did they get 100%. So maybe it's too good to be true. And I have seen in the past and heard stories about people sharing the answers, and so the answers went around, and the way everyone got 100% of every question right was They weren't actually doing the training and doing the inbuilt tests themselves. They were just copying somebody else's homework. And clearly they're the wrong behaviors, and that should be spotted and addressed. I've seen situations where 100% mandatory training is really good. Everyone is doing it on time. But then I ask the question, so I've got a very compliant organization. People do exactly what they're told to do. Now, that could be because they really wanted to, or it could be that whenever they're told to do something, they will do it. Well, what if that's a sales force and I tell them to sell things to customers? They're going to sell them whether a customer wants it, needs it, or doesn't need it. They're going to be a very compliant sales force. So I can use that bit of information to say, what might go wrong on something important that these people are doing? Conversely, a 90% completion on mandatory training, if I go and talk to the business and say, so what's happening? What's happening with the 10% that didn't complete it? What's happening with the 90% that did? If they tell me this is what we've done with the 10% that didn't complete it, this is how we followed up with them, these are the conversations we've had, this is how we asked them what happened, I might say, that sounds perfect. That sounds like a really good control framework, working well, senior individuals reinforcing the expectations. But each of those objective data points gives me an opportunity to ask questions and learn more about the behaviors, learn more about what's going on, and learn more about what might be a problem in another area. And if I find that people are shortcutting on something like mandatory training and they're cheating the system, what is it they're doing on a day job where they also think it is okay to not do the right thing and cheat the system? And would I want to ask that question? And I go there. And that, as I say, that could be when they're selling to a customer. What are they doing to cheat the system? Another, area when you talk about this in terms of, auditing culture that I would say is really take time to look at the incentive programs that are in place. I guarantee that individuals work out very quickly, if they've got a particular incentive program, how to achieve those incentives. Be really mindful of cliff edge events. So if there's targets to be met by the end of a quarter and it's a sales-based target, have a real look at designing a control framework that looks at the quality of sales that happen on the last day of the quarter, in the last week of the quarter. They are more likely to be high-risk sales than the ones that maybe are happening earlier in the quarter. Just because someone is sat there saying, if I sell 3 more of these things, then I get my bonus for the quarter. And, I've yet to really see humans avoid that potential conflict of interest between what does this mean for me personally and what does it mean for the organization if I sell this to a customer or not. And many of the things I've been involved in the past with, customer mis-selling sit in that category where the incentive program wasn't designed to cause problems, but actually features of it reinforced particular behaviors which did cause problems.
That's such an interesting point, Gavin. You don't need necessarily a culture dashboard to understand what's going on. I think what you really need is what you just said before also, is the ability to listen between the lines. It's about being attentive to what is said and also what is not said and how it is said. Sometimes I think the silence itself is the message. Culture often speaks in nuances, and if you're not tuned in or if you're not listening carefully, you might risk the most important points.
Yeah, I've worked in organizations, Thomas, where, a number of metrics, you are using them a lot of the time. And so it's useful to have those as, I would describe them as proxy indicators.
Mm-hmm.
And always I use them as, some of them could be how well are issues closed by management. But again, if issues are all closed on time, does that mean they were closed properly or not? So, and it could be that someone's stated desire. I mean, a really great tone from the top would be, I really want us to close all issues on time and to get them done. And that could be said with the best of intents. It could be heard by people, which is no issue is ever going to go late. But what about the issue that needs to go late because there's a problem? Does that then get hidden from that boss who said nothing can be late? Typically, when I've spoken to those bosses, they say, no, I said this to my team because I wanted them to understand how importantly, but if they come to me and say, there's a problem with it, then of course I'll let it run overdue because we shouldn't close it if it's not closed. But that might not be what was heard by the individual. So I'd say sometimes these things, you might want a dashboard because they're used a lot. They can be seen regularly. In and of themselves, they don't tell you anything. They just give you a way to say, if the behaviors on these things aren't right, what about the other stuff that this organization is doing? So instead of the mandatory training, they're closing issues internally. If here we have trouble, what are we seeing and feeling in the absolute core business that we're doing on a day-to-day basis? Could we also have some problems in that? Could there be some things going wrong? And so for me, it was a great way in to really try and understand what's happening on the day-to-day business that really mattered to an organization.
Absolutely. I think this is really a great opportunity for internal audit to really connect the dots based on what we learned through our findings.
Absolutely.
But let's now turn to a slightly more delicate challenge. So what happens when leadership isn't exactly enthusiastic about the idea of culture being audited? How can internal audit position this kind of work so it's seen as a constructive and value-adding rather than a confrontational or critical piece of work?
As we said earlier, Thomas, I mean, I think sometimes, as I say, if you go out and say to people, we're going to audit your culture, it drives a pretty strong reaction because it feels very personal. And I think you need to have a detailed conversation about how behaviors in an organization can really affect what you'd expect to see in a control framework, how those behaviors over time could become the culture, how the wrong messaging from the top could actually drive some of those behaviors and reinforce them, how the lack of people being able to speak up might result in there being issues. So whilst management would really love to know the really good reasons why something needs to be delivered later, no one dares tell them, and no one does tell them. And as a result, they don't get an opportunity to help manage that situation. So for me, helping individuals understand that this is not about having some binary answer of labeling things good or bad. It really is trying to work out where the control framework and the risk landscape is compromised, could have problems, or where actually you think it's really good and it could sustain some real periods of pressure. And it would be okay when put under some strain or stress. And I saw this during COVID. Areas where we felt in audit functions, the teams were less strong, had more trouble in dealing with external shock like COVID on their practices than those that had a much better attitude to risk. What I would say is a really good test, and I've done this in my career, is to actually audit the culture of internal audit. And auditors have exactly the same reaction as the business when you say you're going to look at their culture. But exposing auditors to that feeling of what is the attitude to risk and practiced risk inside an internal audit function? Do auditors shy away from raising an issue when they really should be saying it is an issue and pushing on it? Assessing auditors on that same basis through a quality assurance and improvement program actually does help build a lot of good skills in how you might then go out to the business. It helps people have a better understanding of how we as audit make the business feel, because it's how we felt when our own people inside our function assessed whether we had the right attitude to risk when we were undertaking our audit work.
So much of this comes down to the tone, isn't it, Gavin? Not just from the leadership, but I think even more and probably most importantly from us as internal auditors too. How can we frame a culture review in a way that invites to honest reflection rather than triggering defensive behaviors?
I think for me, Thomas, it's all about this, probably focusing firstly on behaviors. So actually making it quite explicit that in each audit you're going to look at what it is we'd expect people to be doing, how we'd expect them to be doing it, and that we will talk about whether those behaviors bring a bigger risk to a control framework. So some people will talk about that as being root causes and getting to the root causes of things. I think it is equally good to be expanding the communication about root causes into not just what I would typically do, capabilities, competency, capacity, those sorts of topics, but where behaviors underneath are resulting in some of those things that we expect to be happening in a control framework not happening, where we might need the tone from the top to be a little bit different, while we might want monitoring to delve a little bit deeper and ask more probing questions. Yeah, another saying of what gets monitored gets done. Sometimes the sheer fact that someone is looking at something in greater detail means that the right behaviors happen. And the fact that it's not being looked at means people take shortcuts. So absolutely, there's a lot about tone. And I think if you talk about how audit is doing the right thing of really assessing the effectiveness of the control framework, it is obvious why we're looking at behaviors.
So let's turn the lens inwards for a moment. Do we as internal auditor truly possess the skills, the mindset and the sensitivity required to audit culture with credibility? Gavin, you highlighted the crucial importance of how we communicate, not just what we say, but the tone and the intent behind as we communicate. So the real question becomes, what capabilities must we strengthen to engage meaningfully in the space and bring genuine impact? How can we ensure that our presence and approach fosters trust, openness, and constructive dialogue rather than resistance and defensiveness?
I actually think all auditors should be thinking, I've got a lot of the skills and capabilities to do this. It's about properly assessing effectiveness of a control framework. It's looking at, as I said, those pervasive elements of a COSO framework. And do I think that a message that's come from the leadership team might be leading to the wrong behaviors? Do I think that the fact that certain things are monitored might mean that people shortcut? Absolutely, these are core skills for assessing the sustainability of a control framework over time, assessing the effectiveness. And I think a lot of that is noticed. I mean, way before people were talking about auditing culture, I know that audit functions were having conversations about whether people were behaving in the right way when interacting with audit, when closing issues, when doing those things. So auditors have been commenting on behaviors and culture for some time. This is about it being much more part of the day-to-day conversations. Where it gets a little bit trickier, and you might need some real expertise, is if you're starting to look into the psychology of behavior. Why is it that people are doing some of those things? And sure, if you're looking at some of those aspects, maybe you want to bring in some organizational psychologists. Maybe you want to leverage some of the skills that would exist probably in a number of HR functions at looking at why do people do what they're doing. But I think that's going to be a limited amount of the work that happens in any particular organization. Much more can come through with, as you talk about some things like the emotional intelligence, the true listening skills, not just the words that people say, but getting behind the meaning of those words and understanding whether or not the people you're talking to are feeling safe to raise problems with their superiors, or they don't feel safe raising problems. I mean, all of those things are bits that we as auditors find out. And quite often people that we're auditing tell us because there isn't someone else that will listen to them, and they hope that we might be able to help make a difference because they truly want to do the right thing and feel they're not being able to. It's why speak up lines and the sort of those whistleblowing lines are also equally important for where, people genuinely think something is not going well in an organization. I'm quite happy if something is raised and looked into and it turns out that it's all okay. I would rather have a process that does that than where there isn't anything for you to go and have a look and you fail to discover the thing that goes wrong. And I am pretty sure most organizations that have had a significant problem as a result of behaviors and culture, there were a lot of people that knew that there was a problem and maybe didn't know how to speak up, maybe spoke up and weren't listened to, maybe spoke up and, bad things happened to them, which reinforced the need not to speak up in an organization. But I doubt it wasn't known what was happening on the ground by lots of people. And so having a way in which that can be discovered is really important.
Yes, having a well-functioning whistleblowing mechanism is essential for any organization, not just as a compliance requirement, but as a cornerstone of a healthy governance culture for each and every organization. But it doesn't stop at the implementation. It's equally about whether employees generally trust the process. Do they understand how it even works? Do they know where their reports go and whether the channel is internal or is it outsourced? Trust and transparency are so much key here. And this brings us back to the culture, the invisible fabric that influences whether people feel psychologically safe to speak up. I completely agree. A robust whistleblowing system is non-negotiable. What's even more fascinating is how this connects to the evolving role of internal auditors. It's no longer just about being an analyst. Increasingly, we are also part anthropologist, observing human behaviors, interpreting context, navigating complexity, with a balance of professional skepticism and empathy. Gavin, would you agree that that captures the direction we are heading to?
Yeah, I think, I personally, I'd say that I thought that's what auditing was about since I started 30 years ago, that, trying to read between the lines sometimes, trying to, as I say, it's the auditor's nose, being able to walk in somewhere and feel that something doesn't feel quite right. And then, just pulling on some threads to see what maybe unravels as you are in that particular part of the organization. And listening to people when somebody in that part of the organization says, I don't feel happy with what we're doing, ask them about it. And so I think it always has been that. Is it more important now than ever? I think with the failures that we've seen in organizations and the billions of pounds of fines or, compensation, if anyone thinks it shouldn't be important going forward, then I think they probably ought to look for a different career, because I think it's going to be absolutely what defines whether internal audit is successful or not.
Final question, Gavin. How can we ensure as internal auditors that auditing culture doesn't evolve into a box-ticking exercise, but instead becomes a catalyst for genuine dialogue, reflection, and meaningful change within an organization?
So the first bit, so I reinforce what I've said already, which is, start by thinking about looking at behaviors and really just bringing that into the everyday normal life, because for me, it should be as part of auditing. Who's doing what? What are those behaviors? What would I expect to see? And then you can start to extend into, do I think that might be being driven by some tone from the top? Is that driven now by this is now the way we do things around here? I do like the phrase, culture is what happens when nobody is looking. So when nobody is monitoring what's going on, what are people doing? Because that's when they think they might get away with something, the shortcuts. And so always having that in mind, I think, is really important. Then you give yourself the best opportunity to give an opinion on culture in different areas and whether there may be a problem or not. And be willing to say that you think their culture is strong. Don't just tell people when it's not working. Really be brave enough to tell them when it is working. Of course, there needs to be some outcome. A business that has repeatedly a poor culture where the wrong things are in the tone from the top, I would expect there to be consequences. If a poor culture is rewarded through bonus structures, I guarantee that nothing is changing. Because why would somebody change what they're doing when what they're doing is making them very successful personally? And so the other message I would say is, really understand incentive structures and incentive schemes. When somebody has this personal objective to achieve, you need to think whether or not it is truly in line with the corporate objective. And when humans are in that position of conflict, I need to do this to achieve something personally, but ultimately it might harm the organization. I think a lot of people will choose, I need to do this thing in this way because it benefits me personally. And they are the things to be really looking out for. I said it before in one of the previous podcasts, Thomas, I'll say it again. There is a really good thing about the cleansing power of daylight. Having some of these conversations, even if they turn out not to be right, is much better than never having the conversation and it turns out that there was a problem. So being open to exploring with a business, how could things cause an issue? And even just seeing what the reaction is will tell you something else about the behaviors and the culture. You will learn something about it that might be useful at some point in the future when you say, I really need to make this point to the organization because I think there's some sort of existential risk that could harm us.
Gavin, once again, thank you for guiding us through this nuanced and essential conversation with such clarity and insight. Culture is subtle, it's multifaceted, and it's deeply human. But that doesn't place it beyond the reach of internal audit. On the contrary, it calls us to engage with greater curiosity, courage, and care. As always, Gavin, if there is one thing you want our listeners to take away from today's conversation, what would that be?
The key thing for me, Thomas, would be always to have culture in mind at the same time as behaviors. So really then focus on the behavior part of it first and think about, are these behaviors part of something much broader or just something individual that's going on for a person or locally? Before diving straight into the culture topic, which is vast and huge. Bring behaviors into the everyday focus of audit.
Thank you so much, Gavin. And with that say to our listeners, thank you for joining us for today's episode of Governance Unplugged. Auditing culture isn't about passing judgment on values. It's about understanding behaviors, exploring interactions, and enabling wiser decisions. I hope today's conversation encouraged you to see culture not as a minefield to be avoided, but as a powerful space for deeper insight, greater influence, and meaningful opportunities for you as an internal audit function. Be sure to subscribe and rate the podcast on your preferred platform, be it Apple Podcast or Spotify, and share your thoughts on LinkedIn or visit us on www.keystone-governance.ch. And as always, let's build smarter, more resilient organizations, one conversation at a time. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep driving governance excellence.